I suppose one of the big problems is in Ireland it's very hard to ascertain who, if anybody, is making money out of agriculture. Now I find it very hard to believe that nobody is making money. I should say, because people will say that farmers are always complaining. I mean, it was I'm a beef farmer, and it was this year was quite a good year for beef farmers, I suppose. Prices at least up to the latter end of the, sorry, when I say this year, I mean last summer was quite good, at least the earlier part of it. But obviously they cut prices very severely as the year progressed, and I suppose made up for the fact that the beef factories had to pay quite handsomely for beef in the earlier part of the year, but they more than compensated for that towards the end of the year. And I suppose weather conditions meant that farmers were under pressure to get beef off the land and sell them into the factories, and became once again price takers, not in much of a position to negotiate the price that they were going to obtain for those cattle. But so while farmers' margins are being squeezed throughout, particularly in the beef sector, we do see that the big processors have done very well. I mean, I'm not one to criticise a successful businessman, but I mean, Larry Goodman's success as a businessman has been remarkable. I mean, he owns the building along with others. I'm not saying there's anything untoward in the fact that he owns it, not at all suggesting that. But I mean, he has done sufficiently well to be able to own the building that the Irish Department of Health is located in. That's not indicative of a sector where nobody is making money. It's certainly, he has managed to make quite a lot of money out of that sector. And the big problem that we have is that we don't know where the money is being made. We know what farmers are being paid for their beef. We know what their input costs are. So we have a rough idea around the cost of production. And we know what beef is being, you can walk into any butchers and find out what they're charging per kilo for various cuts. You can go down any supermarket aisle and see what those supermarkets are charging. But we know nothing in between. And that really came to the fore during those protests, that we don't know what the various outlets are paying the processors for the various cuts of meat. And we don't know what their conditions are either around age, for example. It was one of the things that featured in those protests. And one, Lidl, if I'm not mistaken, said that was it Lidl or Aldi said that they didn't care whether beef was under 30 months or whether it wasn't. They were prepared. It was Aldi, excuse me. It was Aldi. And it was very much welcomed at the time that they made that announcement. The others were much, and of course Supermax said the same thing. They're not a retailer of raw beef. Obviously they sell a very large amount of Irish beef, and that's to be welcomed. But the processors always hid behind well, that's what the retailers are looking for. They want beef under 30 months, but nobody was in a position to independently verify that. And if the retailers were looking for beef under 30 months, well, what was the reasoning behind that? Was there any reasoning behind that other than it was something that they were able to use to push down prices? Because there was quite a scarcity of beef in the first part of last year, such that, as I say, prices were okay for farmers. I couldn't complain about what the prices were. But nobody cared whether they were under 30 months, over 30 months. Didn't really feature at all in the discussions. But suddenly when beef was plentiful again towards the latter end of the year, and weather was bad and farmers were under pressure to sell, suddenly there was a world of a difference between cattle that were in spec under 30 months and cattle that were over, which leads farmers to be very, very cynical about all of this grading system and this 30 months requirement. Is it? Because it's a lot easier in the west of Ireland. I appreciate you're from the west of Ireland yourself, Minister. I appreciate you from a farming background, as are many deputies in this House. But, it's difficult, if not impossible, to finish cattle on grass under 30 months unless you're giving them, feeding them meal or nuts. We had a discussion once. You said it was very possible. I still disagree with you that it's easy to finish. It's very difficult to finish cattle under 30 months unless you're giving them supplements in Ireland. And of course, supplements are expensive, and they're becoming increasingly expensive, and they also are imported from many of the ingredients that go into those rations are imported from across the world, many of them from the southern hemisphere. And that brings with it its own carbon footprint. And the response to, one of the responses of your department has been to suggest that we're going to reduce emissions in the agriculture sector, and particularly in the beef sector, by reducing the age at which cattle are finished. Now, if you're going to reduce it down to 24 or 26 months, it's not going to be, simply not possible to finish cattle at 24 or 26 months without giving them large amounts of rations. And if you're going to count in the carbon footprint of those rations, I just think it's going to be highly counterproductive. So while the beef retailers and the processors are forcing cattle to finish earlier, I'm not convinced that it's particularly environmentally beneficial to do so, because the natural order of the majority of cattle born in Ireland are born in the spring, and they are ready, if they're not being fed supplements, they're ready to kill towards certainly the latter half of the summer of their third summer, so when they're 30 months if you're lucky, up to 36 months. And that is the cheapest way that you can produce cattle in Ireland. But because of this 30 months requirement, farmers are being forced into a more expensive production model. And I suppose my question is, who does that benefit, and what is the purpose of that? And can we have a little bit of transparency around this? Your bill, unfortunately, just relies on information which is already in the public domain, and of course the price that the retailers pay processors is not in the public domain. There is a bill in America which was brought in response to the huge power of sorry, I'd correct the record, it was Lidl said that they were going to buy cattle at over 30. Well, it's very important because they were willing to go against cartel-like behaviour by all of the other retailers. So it was quite an important development at the time. But going back to this 30-month, the price at which the cattle are, the price that processors are paid by the retailers is important. They're not going to give that out unless they're forced to give it out. And then just one other point I wish to make is that you talk about unfair trading regulations may prohibit a requirement for the supplier to bear all or part of, this is section 58.5, all or part of the cost of any discounts on agricultural and food products that are sold by the buyer as part of a promotion, unless the buyer, prior to a promotion that is initiated by the buyer, specifies the period of the promotion and expected quantity of the agriculture and food products to be ordered at the discounted price. So even that will still enable buyers to force producers to pay for the cost of the promotion in the supermarkets. And of course they won't have any choice around that if they want an outlet for their product. So Minister, there's just two, I look forward to discussing this bill in greater detail, but there's just two of the flaws that I see at the moment. But I welcome the fact that you're moving it forward at last, though.
We're making every effort possible to bring transparency. Will be very effective, I hope, in relation to ensuring that the fairest deal and farmers get the best crack in terms of the income that they get for the massive hard work that they do, because there's no doubt in relation to the early hours, the long weekends, the late nights, that it goes in at farm level, and the amount of time that goes from whenever the lamb is born or the calf is born or the cow starts to milk to the point where that produce leaves the farm. There's massive work goes in there. There is work undoubtedly that goes in after that, important work too, but the time is less, and we have to ensure that the farmer, who very often, the primary producer, the fisher, the horticulturalist, that the situation where too often, where there's a squeeze in the system, they are the one that has to absorb all that pain, because the margins can be maintained at other levels of the supply chain because the capacity is there to manage that more so, and farmers ultimately get squeezed. And I think particularly in the year we've just had, coming out of unprecedented changes in terms of cost inputs and inflation emerging from the illegal invasion of Ukraine, it has spoken and it has very much brought to the fore the need to have responsive supply chains. A supply chain that moves with the reality of life and that reflects and understands the challenges that's there for the primary producer, and that doesn't leave them carrying the can in terms of the cost and losing money, while others can adjust to maintain their margins. So the real key objective here is putting in place a statutory office which will be an actor in that space, ensure that that space is as healthy as it possibly can, be an advocate, be a pusher, and be an enabler to ensure that farmers get fair play, and that family and primary producer incomes are very much at the centre of all of our thoughts.